You're watching Channel 4 Schools.
The town of Halifax grew rich on the textile industry. Everywhere there are textile mills, factories that spin yarn and weave cloth. But most of the old mills aren't making cloth anymore. All over the region are buildings that tell the story of the textile industry. We're going to see how it began high up in the hills, then moved down the steep valleys to the first factories. They spread along the valley floors and towns grew up around them. Today, industry is still changing, moving on. Halifax is in Calderdale, a region of West Yorkshire. It's a river basin of steep valleys and high moorland. Halifax grew in the valley bottom. But the industry began in scattered settlements high up on the valley shelves, like Luddenden. Even down below the high moorland, the soil is acid and the valley sides are steep. This is not good land for field crops, but it makes fine pasture for grazing sheep. Their wool needs plenty of washing before it can be spun, and the soft rainwater of the streams up here is ideal. There's no scum when you use soap. In this part of Britain, farms were owned by independent smallholders. They made extra money weaving their wool into cloth. This was a cottage industry. Weavers' cottages had plenty of windows so that they could see to work. Downstairs, the children helped by combing washed wool into long strands. Women twisted the strands together into a long thread on a spinning wheel. Men worked upstairs where there was more daylight, weaving the threads through each other with a wooden shuttle. Hard work, but very precise. Stamping woven cloth to bind the threads together was hard work too, but unskilled and boring. This was the first job to be mechanised using a new source of power. Just down the valley, Jowler Mill powered its first machines with a water wheel, like this one. The weight of the falling water turned the blades of the wheel. The axle in the middle of the wheel ran through the wall into the mill, lifting heavy hammers that stamped the cloth mechanically. People stopped doing this job at home. Instead, pieces of cloth were brought here to be finished. Then inventors got more ingenious. Water power could be used to turn hundreds of bobbins at once, replacing the spinning wheel. Now the weavers and spinners themselves had to come down to the mills to work. Change came even faster with the development of steam-powered machines that needed not only water, but coal. The industry moved again. First canals and then railways were built along the valley bottoms to bring the coal. New mills sprang up alongside them and the towns began to grow. Now Yorkshire towns had two great advantages. They were near supplies of coal to drive the steam-powered machines and iron for making the heavy machinery itself. And as all production moved to the big mills, people had to come and live and work in the towns. First they came from the hillside cottages, later from Ireland and Scotland, and then even from overseas. The mill owners built tight rows of workers' housing within walking distance of the factories. It was a hard life, working long hours and living crammed together away from the fresh air of the hills. But the businesses grew wealthy on it, and their owners made and spent a lot of money. There's a French chateau in the middle of Halifax. The industry grew comfortable and the urge to invent was stifled. Working in Victorian mills, many firms didn't invest in new technology. These machines have hardly changed for 100 years, but they're still being used commercially. Norman's loom is in a museum.
Well, this loom came from Holsworth. It was weaving cloth in 1890. I picked it up in 1983. We met together here in the Halifax Industrial Museum. Because, of course, the trade died and there were few and far between with the jobs that they'd done. They had to find some other means of living. And so, in effect, they changed their whole lifestyle. Others have never worked since. I was one of the fortunate ones who found a position with a loom that was redundant, and I was redundant at the same time.
Halifax used to be world famous for its carpets. Now the showrooms are full of cheaper imports from Belgium and the United States. Woolen mills all over Calderdale closed down and tens of thousands lost their jobs. Now Yorkshire was being left behind. To survive today, you have to modernise and specialise. One company in Halifax makes seat covers for public transport, from Singapore to Greenland, Australia to the Channel Tunnel. They're still working in their old buildings, but using the very newest technology. Designing on computer means they can make new patterns available very quickly. This one's for buses in Kansas. They don't employ so many people as before, but the basic processes are still the same. They buy wool that's already washed and dyed, but it still has to be spun. This is a healthier job than it used to be. Now the wool dust is constantly vacuumed away. This machine puts a tight twist into the threads for strength. It's an incredibly fast and accurate spinning wheel. Then the yarn is steamed to keep the twist in place, like setting the curls in someone's hair. But it's a job to keep track of all the colours in the yarn store where Tariq works.
We've got 71 blues and 54 greys, different type of greys and different kind of blues.
Workers here have a test for colour blindness at their interview.
We number them up so we know where exactly they are, what department they will be in, and what side to look at.
Four there. That one first, that's the most important.
I work 12 hours a day, and it's five days a week. I work Saturday and Sunday half a day, and that's it. And then back to normal.
The mill works round the clock, and there's not much time to be with his family and friends. Tariq shares a car with his brothers. He's just finished work for the day. They've just driven in to clock on for the night shift. Yurif's training to be a weaver.
I work 12 hours a night. That's about 60 hours a week. I mean, that's with overtime and everything. You actually start at 10 o'clock till 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm actually an assistant to the weaver, putting bobbins on.
Each bobbin has to be replaced before it runs out, and the new thread tied onto the old one. They haven't invented a machine to do this yet, but the new looms run really fast. The pattern's controlled by computer, and the actual weaving is done with a double shuttle. Two sets of shuttles swap threads in the middle. One set runs out from each side, so they only have to travel halfway, and the weaving is twice as fast. The pattern is woven in between two backings, then it's slit down the middle to give two rolls of cloth. These days the cloth doesn't need to be stamped on, but it's steamed again to make the twisted threads unwind and fluff out. And customers need to be sure that their seat covers will last. This machine mimics the action of thousands of hours of passengers' bottoms.
Nights. I mean, not everybody likes nights. So, depends if you're working on days, it's much better. And you see more of the daylight. And nights you don't.
The women in the Siddiqui family don't go out to work. But Basharat might go to work in the mill straight from school, like his older brothers Yurif and Tariq. Basharat's father came here from Pakistan 30 years ago. Then, Britain was advertising for people to come from overseas and fill jobs in the booming factories.
It was widely advertised, and I asked the people who read the newspapers. They told me about it. It was good for the jobs around here, though it was cold. I got a job in Union Factory on Pelham Lane. Just a labouring job at first. Yorkshire is a good place. The work was good when I came. But now there's a work shortage because of the new technology. Where there were 10 people working, there's only one. In Victoria Mill, where I used to work, 10 people's jobs are done by just 2 machines, with only 1 person minding them.
Now the textile mills are either closed or modernised, jobs are harder to find. But this generation have different expectations too, and Basharat doesn't really want to work in the mill.
What I don't like why is you do the same thing every time all night. It's quite boring really, isn't it? All you do is put bobbins on.
He's hoping to train as a sports teacher.
If I get good grades and go on to college, university, teaching, coaching.
Inside, the girls are making things to raise money for the club. Shakila and Yamila have very clear ambitions.
Ever since I was in junior school, I've always wanted to become a lawyer. I've always had this ambition of being myself and going to courts and doing cases.
My father used to work in a mill. That was about 10, 12 years back. 10, 12 years ago, that's about it. Then they closed down.
Before, like, there were a lot of mills. When my parents came here, you know, they're all working in mills. And nowadays, I mean, there's no one hardly working in any mills. Like, they're all in the taxi jobs and everything. So I think it has changed, but I don't know about the future. I don't know how it's going to change in the future.
Buildings left by the textiles industry have new uses now. Jowler used to be a water-powered spinning mill. Then Roger and his wife turned it into a family house. But there's an office on the ground floor, so Roger can run his insurance business from home. A 100 years ago, children Max and Emma's age would have been working in the spinning shed. But there's a much bigger change down in Halifax itself. Dean Clough was once the biggest carpet factory in the world, 10 huge mill buildings clustered together. Now it's a centre for light industry and the arts. Richard couldn't afford a studio out on his own.
It's nice to be a member of the artist group, in contact with other artists rather than work in total isolation on your own.
Ed's making a sculpture for Liverpool city centre.
Well, it's nearly 13 foot high from its hoofs to the top of the main, and I think it's about 12 foot 6 from tail to the tip of its hoofs that way. It's good for the mill complex to have things going on here, because otherwise it'd be just another mill. So I mean, it attracts tourists, and there's a lot of people who come around the galleries, and they get to see everything that's going on.
But Britain's biggest building society are the main employers here now. They've lowered the ceilings, but you can still see pillars holding up the floors to support the old machinery. And there is still manufacturing industry in Dean Clough. This company makes shelves and display units for shops and chain stores. They're using 3 of the old mill buildings.
It's been fantastic for us as the Dean Clough site, because it's enabled us to expand and expand and expand, but we've reached the point where we need to put all of the manufacturing units together under one roof. As you can see, our offices are cramped, to say the least. I mean, we couldn't expect people long term to continue working in such cramped conditions, and that's why we're moving to Lowfields.
Clive's moving his business because they need more space, but also to be near the motorway network that links them to customers. Lowfields is one of the new industrial estates along the M62.
If you're close to the motorway network, then you can move things very cheaply. I mean, we're moving never less than 40 tonnes a week. It can be as high as 60 or 80 tonnes a week. The added cost of moving things in Britain is all really linked to how far it is from the motorway.
Industry changes the landscape it moves through. This was the site of a coal-fired power station. Now it's redundant, and the local council are encouraging new businesses to move in. But who knows what these new industries will be, and how long they will stay. Where the sea meets the land, the results can be devastating. All these people's jobs and homes are under threat. This road was built for a village that simply isn't here anymore. So what's going on? We're going to travel down the northeast coast between Flamborough Head and Spurn Point to see how this coastline's changing. This coastline was not always where it is today. 100,000 years ago, there was a shallow bay here. An ice sheet covered northern Europe and was expanding across the North Sea. The ice was wearing away at the seabed, lifting up large boulders, stones, sand and clay as it moved. Finally, the ice sheet stopped growing and started melting. As it retreated, it left behind a thick, soft blanket of the mud, stone and sand it had been carrying. This is called boulder clay. The ice melted and the sea rose again. Settlers soon started to farm this new expanse of soft boulder clay. But over the years, more than 30 villages have disappeared. This is Europe's fastest eroding coastline. Here at Flamborough Head, the sea meets hard chalk deposits. Cliffs up to 30 metres high have been cut by the waves. How can waves form cliffs? Where the waves hit the base of the cliff, they make a notch undercutting it. The weight of the overhanging chalk pulls it crashing to the beach. Each time this happens, a new cliff face is formed further inland. So these cliffs have been formed by a series of these relatively small notches, like this. The seawater and rain can force their way into small cracks and fissures. Small faults can turn into large caves. This used to be a cave in the side of a headland. The sea is worn all the way through to make an arch. As erosion continues, the roof will fall away too, leaving a stack standing alone out to sea. Further south, the hard white chalk dips down under the soft brown boulder clay which was left by the ice sheet. Because these cliffs are softer, erosion here is faster. Sometimes there's hardly time to form a notch before the whole cliff slumps down. Metres of land can be lost every year. This really matters when people live close to the edge. Mr. Cross lives in the seaside village of Barmston.
We purchased this property some 11 years ago, in the full knowledge that sooner or later it would drop into the sea. At that time we were something like 40-50 yards from the cliff edge, and now we're more like 20. I understand that there's something like 30 houses running parallel to the cliff top right down the coast there, which have all disappeared into the sea utterly and completely.
These water pipes and electricity cables used to be connected to houses that were swallowed by the sea.
It is horrific. I think it's all to do with the type of material of which the cliffs are composed.
When the boulder clay is eroded by waves, tiny clay particles are taken up by the water and float in a fine suspension. You can see this thick brown water along the shoreline. Larger sand particles and stones from the eroding boulder clay are carried southwards along the beach by wind and waves. Along the coast at Mappleton, the local council have built rock walls called groins. These stick out to sea and catch the drifting particles, building up this protective beach in front of the town. This keeps the waves from attacking the cliffs at Mappleton, but has effects further south. Sue Earle runs a farm a kilometre away.
They put a rock groin, which is a rock barrier going out to sea, made of rocks from Norway, and this has stopped the sediment coming down to our land and protected the bottom of our cliff. So we did have an erosion rate of 3 feet a year, and now we get 30 feet a year. And if you go to the bottom of the cliff, you can see big boulders of clay, and there is no sand on the beach. So every tide, when the tide comes in, it's hitting the bottom of the cliff and eroding the clay away. In the wintertime, the house shakes when the sea hits the bottom of the cliff. This is basically a livestock, animal farm. All our cows are Friesians, and unfortunately they're very inquisitive. If the earth is unstable, and they can fall down the cliff. We have chickens, we have 8 cats and 3 dogs. Also, we have 3 Shetland ponies.
But the dairy has got to be demolished before it also falls into the sea.
All the cows will have to be sold this next year because we cannot afford to build a new dairy. In front of the house and the dairy there was fields where the cows used to graze and crops could be grown, but that is now all gone.
In 35 years, the sea has eaten over 60 metres inland.
When they do protect an area, it does cause problems in other areas and increase the erosion for somebody else.
Further down the coast is the seaside resort of Withersea. These old sea defences are worn out. The force of the waves shakes the houses behind. The local council are investing in new sea defences to protect the town from this destructive energy. Harry is the site manager in charge of building a new sea wall.
This is where we're going to put the base, and this is the actual wall. And then we project the wall up into a splashback. So when the waves hit the wall, it splashes and throws the water back into the sea.
This design doesn't just stop the waves, it deflects their energy harmlessly out to sea. Hundreds of these sections are being cast in reinforced concrete, making a solid wall along the seafront. Outside this wall, they're adding a second sea defence that's come all the way from Norway on this gigantic barge. These are hard granite boulders weighing 10 tons each. They're going to be piled up in front of the seawall. Because they can move a bit as the waves hit them, they absorb some of the sea's energy before it reaches the wall. These new sea defences stretch over a kilometre along Withersea Beach. Erosion is a problem for big business too. Out in the North Sea, drilling platforms bring up gas from the rocks 2 miles below. This gas is pumped 18 miles back to dry land to the British Gas Terminal at Easington. Here they purify it, ready for use in factories and for cooking and heating at home. At its busiest, a quarter of all Britain's gas comes through this site. It's here because this land is the closest to the offshore gas fields. This is where all the different processes are controlled. They even give the gas a smell for safety. They thought North Sea gas would last 25 years, so they built this terminal far enough away from the soft clay cliffs to last that long. But the gas is still flowing. Now the sea is only 12 metres from the fence. Jim, an engineer at the terminal, is worried about how quickly the cliff is eroding. They're making plans for their own sea defences. They'd like to make a wall of rocks along the base of the cliffs, like those at Withernsea. Flamborough, Barmston, Mappleton, Cowden Farm, Withernsea and Easington Gas Terminal are all along this eroding coastline. And just south is Spurn Point. Spurn Point is a long narrow spit of sand and shingle. Depending on the direction of the wind and waves, material is deposited here or washed away. Last century, groins were built to protect the spit. Without them, Spurn might have been washed into the sea years ago. Behind the spit is a nature reserve, sheltered from the North Sea waves. Barry Spence monitors the wildlife in the mudflats.
When birds are on migration, that's when they're going from the summer quarters to the winter quarters or vice versa. They need somewhere to stop and rest up and feed. The mudflats themselves obviously provide that area for that type of bird that feeds there, like the wading birds, ducks, geese, etc. Bushes and fields provide an area for them to feed up, I'll say when they're either moving north or south. So lots of rare plants and rare insects actually occurring here. There are, of course, lots of special birds occur here on migration as well. Thousands of years ago, it didn't exist, of course. It's only since the Ice Age that it's existed. I mean, the natural coastline before the Ice Age was Hull, where the chalk begins. The sea is claiming back what it had in the first place. It's just eroding the Ice Age clays away back to the original coastline.
At the end of the spit is Spurn Point itself. This is a base for the lifeboat and Humber pilot services. From here, navigators travel to and from ships to guide them through dangerous Humber estuary with its narrow channels and shifting mudbanks.
An average day, a slow day, we do about 80 ships with pilots on board. Ferry boats, coasters, fishing boats, barges, pleasure craft.
Speaking. Yes, good evening, Mr. Ford. What time are you going to be off Albert Dock, please? Yeah, it should fit in.
You can get down for 6 o'clock, we'll have a launch there for you.
At low water, all this light blue will be shown as mud when you look outside. This is shallow water, or shallowish water. And then this gets to be deep water, and the black is the very deep water. The erosion comes down the coast. At any one time, at high water, there's about 3 million tonnes of silt suspended. Consequently, next day there's a new sandbank or a new mud pile. It's very nice to come down for the day, jump on the bus or the motor car. But to actually live here, you've got to be a special breed.
And a special breed they are. Spurn Point is base for the lifeboat service too. From here they carry out rescue operations along the coast and in the busy estuary itself. It's the only full-time lifeboat in Britain. Dave Steenvoorden is a member of the crew.
The Humber being one of the busiest shipping estuaries in the country now, with 100 shipping movements a day. So the lifeboat is absolutely perfectly situated. It's like having all the emergency services in the middle of the M1. We average one call out a week, and over the last 2 days we've had 4, for a total of about 30 hours for all 4. So we're all a little bit tired at the moment.
Dave lives right on the tip of Spurn, in a small village built especially for lifeboat families. He lives with his wife Karen and their 2 boys, Carl and Scott.
For the actual nature of how we live, I would think it's the same as living in a goldfish bowl. You work with the same people, you live with the same people, but it's got more advantages than disadvantages. There's always a babysitter, there's always somebody to go for a cup of tea, and it's like a big family.
We run a little tea shop. We actually bought it off one of the other crew that retired a couple of years ago. We've kept it going purely for, you know, the bird watchers and tourists that come down here, because I think at the end of the 3.5 miles when they get here, they need a cup of tea.
The best thing's the peace and quiet, and the bad thing's about when all your friends are going out to the swimming pool and all that and you can't go with them.
Just this thin spit of land connects them to the mainland.
There was one time when the sea just washed the roadway and took all the sand away, so it undermined and just went. And the bus couldn't come and pick us up, so we had to stay at home till the road was repaired. The road was like on a slant, and then one wave, and then when that wave went, there was no road, it was just beach.
You know, we don't really know what's going to happen if there is a major breach. They'll probably move the wives and kids off the point. And I think eventually it will become an island. And I say, you know, they really ought to think about doing something. You know, there's 7 families down here and the pilots and that. You know, people tend to forget us down this end.
From north to south, erosion is affecting local people, farmers, seaside towns, industry, wildlife and essential services. Even though families may lose their homes, Spurn Point is to be left to the action of the sea. London is a capital city, but who's it for? Different people are looking for different things. Millions of tourists visit every year.
It's a great crowd of tourists and they're coming down the street. Losers punch for brand new Dr. Martens on their feet.
They want tradition, historical buildings and ceremony.
Or a Chinese bubble hat, trying to stare in the window of a local butcher shop like a pack of wild dogs. They run up
and West End shopping.
His hair standing on end, shouts and rants in the ear of his imaginary friend.
And And every day, more than 1 million people travel in from the suburbs. They need office buildings to work in. It's a crowded city, but it's not just here for tourists and commuters. People live here too, even right in the middle of London, and they have very different priorities. Amy lives in Coin Street in Waterloo, just south of the River Thames. For Amy and her friends in Coin Street, it's important to have room to play and a proper house to live in. But this land was nearly covered by offices too.
I couldn't imagine that this would have just been office blocks and blocking the river, because the river's been there all my life, and that's a big part of London.
Ernie next door helped lead the fight to stop big business taking over their neighbourhood.
We're in the centre of London now, in an area called Waterloo, but it wasn't always like this. We took on two major developers fighting for these changes, fighting for this land and the use of this land.
There will always be conflict over the way land is used. We're going to see how this small community have survived, where others have lost out. Today, Greater London is 50 kilometres across, but it had a small beginning here on the banks of the River Thames. There was just marshland where Waterloo is now, but land in the North Bank was firmer, easier to settle. Romans built the first bridge and a walled settlement that's the business district today. It's still known as the City. In the 11th century, Westminster became the centre of government. The land between filled in with houses and shops to make the West End, Oxford Street and Piccadilly Circus. Along the river, ships unloaded at crowded wharfs and jetties on the North Bank. Later, they expanded to the South Bank, including Waterloo. As trade and the ships themselves grew bigger, they started using the marshy land downstream. Giant docks were scooped out of the soft clay. It's here in Docklands, downstream from Waterloo, we'll first see how land use has changed. This film from the 1930s shows how busy the London Docklands used to be. Cargo ships came from all over the world with food and raw materials for Britain's industries. Some went straight to factories nearby. Some would be unloaded onto smaller barges to be tugged to wharfs upriver. Thousands of dockers used to work here. But when cargoes started to be carried in containers, the ships moved on to more modern docks elsewhere in Britain. By the 1980s, the docks were empty and there was conflict over what should take their place. Local people hoped for new jobs and better housing. Developers wanted to make money building office blocks. The planning laws were changed so developers could go ahead and build without a public inquiry. The idea was to make a whole new business district. But businesses in the city didn't want to move here. For a while, the buildings stayed empty amid the abandoned docks. The redevelopment didn't work for local people either, the real East Enders. Even when businesses did move in, most jobs were for office workers from outside. The newspaper industry came here to escape its cramped old buildings in the city and so that they could employ fewer people. Robots move the paper around now.
it's all new technology, new machinery, it's all computerised now. Whereas we never had none of this in Fleet Street. It was all manual labour.
Ray Murrell is one of the few who kept his job when the industry modernised and moved to the Docklands. He doesn't come from round here himself and has a long drive home these days. Ray's not an East Ender. He lives upriver. His home is Waterloo in Coin Street, where Amy lives. There was conflict here too between commercial developers and local people. But in this corner of Waterloo, the story was very different from that of Docklands. The result was that Ray and his wife Molly could move their family out of an overcrowded flat into a proper house in the neighbourhood.
Well, the children was prisoners really, because they weren't allowed to play out because we was too high up. So to come here, and they had the garden, the freedom to walk out of their street door, and the children seemed to take liberties and play out longer, which is an unfortunate thing sometimes when you try and get them in.
They've got their separate gardens and a communal place to meet and make friends.
It's really nice that we've got a big central garden, we can all go out and play.
But Coin Street didn't just happen, people had to struggle for it. Amy's mum Anne has been involved for many years.
The first thing that I can remember fighting for was a piece of greenery for children to play in, and I was 15, I was on the Tenants Association, and we fought for that bit of grass and we got it. I call this our little village green, right in the middle of London.
Waterloo used to be densely populated, not much room for gardens.
It was a mixed area of industrial area and housing. The people lived in the area actually worked in these industries. So all these kind of jobs came, within 10 minutes walk away from here. Even Fleet Street is only over the river. I was a printer. I used to walk to work in 15 minutes. You had wharves and wood yards and small printers, etc. So you had smaller boats coming up, unloading the big boats, the big ships, into barges.
Barges used to bring cargoes from Docklands to the smaller wharfs here in the middle of London for the wholesale markets and for processing in local factories. It was a busy, crowded area. The Second World War did enormous damage to London. Factories and houses were destroyed in the bombing. In Waterloo, 3/4 of the population left, and many industries never returned. A lot of land needed redeveloping. But instead of new housing, up went a concert hall and then a whole concrete arts complex along the south bank of the river. New businesses moved in: Shell Oil, a computer company, a magazine publisher, a shipping conglomerate, even a television studio. Why did so many businesses want to move here? Waterloo and the South Bank stick out into the middle of London. So they're very close to the central business district, the city. The West End, with its shops and entertainments, is nearby. And Westminster, with the Houses of Parliament, is just over the river. And of course, there's Waterloo Station for the commuters. So developers stood to make much more money building office blocks for businesses. Up went office blocks on the empty sites, while local residents began to feel squeezed in. Then came the last straw, a proposal for a gigantic office complex on the last disused sites.
This scheme they were planning was a wall of offices all the way along the river. This got the local people's backup. So what happened, we started to organise together, local tenants associations, and then formed a neighbourhood council to have our own plan for this area.
Unlike in Docklands, there was a public inquiry. The community's plan for affordable housing had to be considered at the same time as the office plan. It was a struggle, but for once, local people won against big business.
Fortunately, we had the media there. When the police took me outside, when the inquiry started again, we not only got what we asked, the tide started to turn then. So what happened, instead of becoming an active action group against the developers, if you like, what happened, we set up a company, the Queen Street Community Builders, and we became developers.
They took out a bank loan to buy the last disused sites themselves and started building. First, the square on Coin Street itself, which used to be a printworks. Then they knocked down an empty warehouse to make way for a park and a block of modern flats. They won an award, but they're not for sale to newcomers, they're for rent to people on the local housing list. And they're just by the river. But the Coin Street community builders have to pay their way. This bomb site should be more new housing by now, but it's still a car park because it raises money to pay off the bank loan. Commuters pay a lot to park so near the centre of town. This site used to be a wharf for barges. It's in the Coin Street plan for housing too, but for now it's a temporary shopping parade with restaurants and shops paying rent to the Coin Street community builders. But it's not local everyday shopping.
My customers are people who work on the South Bank. They're people from the National Theatre and the Royal Festival Hall, and they're actors, musicians, artists, people who are producers and involved with television studios next door, and lots of office people.
The arts complex brings people to Waterloo. Now the whole south bank of the river is being developed for arts and tourism. This disused power station is going to be a museum of modern art. In Shakespeare's time, theatres weren't allowed inside the city wall, and the south bank had several. Now they're building an exact replica of his Globe Theatre just downstream from Coin Street. And the community builders' latest project is right on the riverside too, just next to their wharf. This used to be a meat processing factory. Barges from the docks downriver used to come here to unload meat for canning. The hoisting platforms have been turned into balconies for the new flats inside. They're going to be great when they're finished, but more expensive than the houses in the square. The rest of the space is for restaurants and shops. Future tenants are already looking round. But who's it for?
So, again, you've got the tower running through the centre of the building. One side of the tower will be the gourmet restaurant, probably this side, but I don't know.
We have an art gallery already in Docklands. And I just thought it might be a suitable sort of location. And it really depends on the sort of people that they can get here and see if they can get people to cross the river.
The art galleries are not geared for us. We've got an art gallery where our butcher was, so, you know, it's not, people look at it and think, oh, what they put that there for? We'd need a little shop that would sell underwear, or socks, something useful. People expect you to be just walk out your door and you're going to find a nice supermarket.
The local population has gone down and there aren't enough people in Coin Street to keep many local services going. Anne goes to the market a few streets away, but it's getting smaller all the time.
The market has gone down greatly. When you walk down there, sometimes you might only see 10 stalls, 15 the most.
It does feel as though a lot of business has moved there, either over to Bridge or to Docklands or whatever, where the rent's cheaper. I suppose that's what's happened.
And there's really not much for the children to do locally either. At least they can walk to the West End from Coin Street.
If you get bored and you've done all your homework, you can just go places. I like going up Oxford Street when I'm a lad with Frankie and Laurie. They've got lots of sports shops and things that I like.
But Amy and her brothers don't have as much money to spend as the tourists.
If you haven't got a lot of money and that, and you see all the kids wearing things what you want and your parents can't afford, then you feel a bit down and sad and that.
If you were developing a city, how would you start out?
What you'd have to do first is design it, space it out, then gather people together and start building it. I'd build a community centre for all children to go and stop having all offices and that. I'd have a swimming pool, a football pitch, a basketball court and some other things.
If you want something, you've got to fight for it. And don't leave your parents or your neighbours to fight for it. Go out there and give your opinion.
This is the calm before the storm at Thurston Comprehensive School.
Please wait by the sports barn, well over to the side. No late buses yet. Well over to the side again.
Emily lives in Thurston Village near the school. She can walk home through the new housing estates. Ben lives in a village 8 kilometres away. He has to catch one of the buses that take pupils to the villages that surround Thurston. The bus carries Ben through the wide open Suffolk countryside and it leaves him 1 kilometre from his home in Norton Little Green. We're going to contrast Ben's village with Emily's and find out how their geography affects their lives. They both live in Suffolk, East Anglia. Emily's village, Thurston, is only 14 kilometres from the large market town of Bury St Edmunds. It has a population of over 3,000 people. Only 200 people live in Norton Little Green, where Ben lives, 25 kilometres from Bury. Flat arable fields come right up to Ben's house. While Ben's sleeping, his dad Roger is already up and getting ready for work.
I suppose working on a farm you tend to get up early. Often I'm out of the house before the rest of the family are, so sometimes I don't see the children until I get home in the evening.
That's not because he has a long journey to work. Roger lives in a house right on the farm which employs him. He doesn't need a car either.
There's no travelling times. I don't have any travelling to and from work because I'm always at work.
The rest of the family haven't had breakfast yet.
Come on, Adam!
Ben's brother Adam has to catch an early bus to school.
Brought you a cup of tea, Ben. We'll be getting up now, so I'm taking Adam, alright?
Alright, thanks.
It would take an hour for Adam to walk to his bus stop, so his mum has to give him and his friend David a lift.
English?
Meanwhile, Ben and his little sister are getting ready for school. Then it's a kilometre hike back to the bus stop for Ben. Back in Thurston, Emily doesn't have to get up for ages, but her dad Paul goes for an early run. Her dad and stepmother Susie both work outside the village.
I moved here because I didn't want to live in a town anymore. I wanted to live out in the country. I managed to get myself a job in Bury St Edmunds, so this seemed an ideal place.
Do you want some fruit?
I work a little bit further away than Suzanne, but again, the roads in and out of Bury St Edmunds via the A14, it's very good. Bury St Edmunds is certainly creeping out to us, and I wouldn't really want to see it get any nearer, because if I'd wanted to live in a suburb, that's where I'd be living. But I wanted to live in a village.
Paul manages a factory over 30 kilometres away.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Susie's a dentist in Bury, which is 10 minutes away by car.
I'll see you in maths, so okay, see you later.
Emily lives in one of the new houses built for commuters. Her paper round takes her through the village. This used to be a field. The oldest houses are at the far end of the village. This used to be the carpenter's house. 150 years ago, this church was at the centre of Thurston. Here's a map from 1841, when most people worked on scattered farms. Around the crossroads near the church were services that farms needed, like a forge and a carpenter's. The railway was built in 1846. A station was located on another crossroads 2 kilometres away. New businesses grew up here, a coal yard and a granary, and soon there were 2 ends to the village. The railway attracted middle-class people to live in Thurston. Now they were able to commute to their jobs in town. The population doubled. New houses were needed. Soon the two ends of the village had joined together. Then the A14 was widened. The school was expanded, attracting more people to the area, like Emily's family, who live near the school here. And they're still building.
The newest estate that's being made now is the building site opposite the school. And they've just torn that field up. We used to walk our dogs there, and so it's been a real disappointment to us. They're calling it the Oaks, and they've just torn down like loads of 200-year-old oaks to build it there.
People like to live out in the countryside, but they also want access to major roads so they can commute to work. New houses need roads and pavements. They need plumbing, running water and drainage systems. A growing village needs many different services. Today is pension day, and Mrs. Wells has come to collect her money from the post office. It's the only general shop for several kilometres, a vital service for people who don't drive.
The area is too far for me. I have to come here to the post office, both to get my groceries and post letters, parcels.
£93.92.
Yes.
It's not just pensioners who rely on the post office. People come from surrounding villages because their own local shops have closed down. And it's getting very crowded. Steve is Thurston's postman. As the village grows, his round is getting bigger. On his route is the old granary by the railway station. It used to be a store for grain from local farms, waiting to be sent out by train. Now the building is used by small businesses and shops.
Hi Steve, how you doing?
Fine, thanks. Just two for you today.
Thanks mate. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Why set up in business here?
Hi, AD.
Afternoon.
Couple of we, mate.
Thanks,
See you
Dave.
later.
Adrian works for the Motor Spares Company.
Half of a business is in town, half of a business is in the country. Central to where we need to be. It's easily accessible from town to Ipswich, to Stowmarket, to Bury St Edmunds with the A14.
The A14 trunk road is a crucial route for haulage vehicles transporting freight from the port of Felixstowe to the Midlands. It's always busy. Would Thurston be so big if it hadn't been near such an important road? The houses in Norton Little Green have always been isolated. People used to live here because they worked on the farms, like Ben's family do today. But since 1841, the hedgerows have disappeared. Bigger fields are easier for the modern farm machinery, needed to grow crops more profitably. Around Ben's house, the main crop is sugar beet.
You start thinking about your sugar beet in the autumn time, when you get your land ploughed up, ready to take the crop the following springtime. You plant the sugar beet seeds, and then they have the whole summer to grow. Various things you have to do during that period, keep the weeds out and stop the aphids eating away at them, keep the rabbits out. But if you can do that, then you start lifting them in September. They go away to the local beet sugar factory in lorries, and then they're processed there into sugar, the sugar that we put in our tea and we make Mars bars out of, and apple crumbles and things. My father, when he left school, he started work here, and when I left school, I started work here. So really life has revolved around this area.
I was born in Buxall, it's about 6 or 7 miles away. When my father first came here, they had horses, horsepower. Now we've got mechanical power. With the modern tractors today, I mean, you need a bit of room to get around, and machinery, you know, that's all got that much bigger, and so we need a bit more space.
Many more people used to work on the land than do today.
Well, there were hedges around all these fields, you see. You couldn't see as far as you can now. It was totally enclosed. When my father first came here, I think there was 12 men, full-time men working on the farm.
Ben's grandmother remembers women working the land too.
I used to chop all the sugar beet out by hand. We used to go and single them and leave one, you see. That was why it was called singling.
Work's easier now that so much is automated, but shopping presents problems.
All our groceries were either brought to the door, or mother-in-law lived down the farm then, and she had a car, and we used to go to Norton village shop to pick them up. The butcher came twice a week, Wednesdays and Fridays. There was a fishman came around, and the baker, of course, called 3 times a week. We didn't go to town very often, not like I do now, because we go regularly once a week.
The milkman is the only service that still delivers to Norton Little Green. The other tradesmen have disappeared because so many people have cars. Even the buses have gone. Instead of services coming to them, customers drive to the services. Ben's mum drives all the way to the superstore at Bury to buy the family's food because she knows she can get everything she needs for the week. Emily's mum does her shopping here too, on the way home from work.
We do need a car to get to work, even just into Bury. Because I work in town and drive out to Thurston, it's quite easy for me to go via a supermarket and get what I want.
I like driving in my car, even with a flat tyre. I like driving in my car.
How can village shops compete with this?
I like driving in my car. I'm satisfied I've got this far.
The superstore is on the edge of town in a retail park. Car owners come from Bury and surrounding villages, so shops can offer bigger stocks and cheaper prices.
Because there is a lot more building now going on the outskirts of Bury, we are starting to get a little traffic problem some mornings.
Bury St Edmunds also is moving out towards Thurston as we move towards Bury St Edmunds, and I personally moved here because I wanted to live in a village amongst other things.
But what does Emily think?
I prefer to be in a town because there's more things to do, nearest to the shops and nearer towards everything else. It's useless trying to rely on my parents because they want to do their own thing, so I have to use whatever transport systems are available. The problem with Thurston Upper is that all the people are from different villages. My 2 best friends, Genevieve and Lily, live miles away from here, so if we want to get together, we have to meet in Bury. We don't always buy stuff. You just sort of go around the shops, try everything on, don't buy anything. It's just a laugh.
Out in Norton Little Green, Ben is far more isolated. Without access to public transport, he spends much more time with his family.
Me and my dad and my brother go to the football at Ipswich. It's quite fun, even though we lose all the time. I've got friends that live over 15 miles away. It's quite hard to go and see them as much as I'd like to. It's good to have a brother who's not too much younger than me, who I can do things with. But I wouldn't like to live too far away from the country because there's different things you can't really do in the town that you can do here. With my dad we go shooting around the farm because he's quite good at shooting and he teaches me how to get a good aim.
Don't point the gun at anyone.
I won't.
Be careful with it.
If Dad had a different job, I don't think we'd be able to do this sort of thing.
If you take the gun, you just use the right-hand barrel and that's the front trigger, all right?
Yeah.
Adam, are you ready?
Ready? Pull. We need to really be on a farm, involved in a farm, to be able to use the facilities. Clay pigeon shooting, wouldn't be able to do that in the town centre.
Some parts of the countryside are growing more and more suburban.
Maybe we'll see some rabbits here, Ben, but I
Yeah.
doubt it.
If we're going to see them anywhere.
But as fewer people actually work on the land, will Norton Little Green get even more isolated?
The study guide, price £4.95, includes important background information, maps, diagrams and statistical information for follow-up activities. A video of the programmes is available, price £35.25. To buy these items, please write, making cheques payable to the Educational Television Company Limited, PO Box 100, Warwick CV 34 6TZ, or call 01926 433333.